Hi everyone, my name is Chris Hendrix. I am a former developer and current director of product management at Styra. We're the creators of the Open Policy Agent, but I'm not going to be talking about kind of any specific vendor tools or anything like that. I'm going to be talking very broadly about authorization, what it means, where we're going. There have actually been quite a few talks during this conference about authorization. And you'll start to see a lot of the same ideas coming from a bunch of different places because we're all trying to influence the market to really step up its game when it comes to authorization, right? So I don't know about you, but my partner does not work in tech, or I am at all. And when I start to explain like what identity, access management, authentication, authorization, their eyes immediately glaze over, right? So I am going to walk us through all of these kinds of things with kind of a real life, non-technical example. And that example is, can I get into the club? A primer on identity and access management. So walking through some of the basics, I'm not going to assume that anyone here has any set of knowledge. I'm going to try and walk us all through it. What is identity? Identity is kind of a way to denote who you are, right? In real life cases, you'll often see driver's license, you'll see social security numbers, you'll see passports. The question of authentication is one of validating that who you say you are is actually who you are, right? It's identity verification. In the case of trying to get into the club, that is the person standing outside who asks you for your ID, looks at your picture, looks at your name, makes sure that it's valid, and then lets you go further into the line, right? The next person that you will see are the beginnings of your authorizers, right? So these are the decision points and some of the enforcement points that you'll see when you're trying to get into the club, right? So that'll be the door person, it'll be a bartender, and those are the people who are making decisions. They're not necessarily the one who are enforcing the decisions, right? That might be the bouncer. So when you get up to the front of the line and they say, can I get into the door? And they say, no, you cannot get in, then it's the bouncer's job to enforce that, right? So like I said, what do you start to see, right? You see that authentication is kind of asking only one question, whereas authorization is asking many questions, many different locations, by many different kinds of people, and that's where you start to see the complexity of what we're talking about now, which is that authentication is maybe less complicated than authorization, right? So here are some kinds of authorization. They are, can I be let in by the door person? Or can I buy an alcoholic drink by the bartender? And if I were to ask any one of you, what are the policies or what goes into making a decision about whether or not someone can be let in? Well, you might say some of these things, right? Like, are you who you say you are? Are you over the age of 18? Do you meet a dress code? Have you bought a ticket, or are you on the guest list? And maybe are you not belligerent or intoxicated? And you'll notice that the policies are different in this case depending on the authorization request. If you're asking to be let into the door, that's different than if you're asking to buy a drink. You may only need to be 18 to get in the door, but you need to be 21 in order to buy a drink. So in our parlance, we call these things decision requests, and we call these things policies. So that'll lead us into the next point, which is my controversial slide, which is unified identity is the past, but unified authorization is the now. And when we're talking about kind of unified authorization, I think that's really the sticking point that we are trying to get the market to understand. Unified means regardless of whether the enforcement point is for infrastructure guardrails or for applications, whether it's workforce identities that you're authorizing or customer identities that you're authorizing, regardless of the line of business, regardless of if it's custom off-the-shelf software or it's custom in-house software. That's what unified authorization means in this case. So unified authorization consists of at least 3 pillars, but 3 makes a nicer number. So those are externalized, modernized, and centralized. So unified authorization is externalized. You will have heard this many times before. What does externalizing mean? It means that the places which are enforcing authorization decisions are not the ones who are making those decisions. Whoever's enforcing it is asking someone else whether or not someone should be able to do something. That's what externalizing your authorization or externalizing your decisions means. And what that allows you to do is externalize your policy representation. When we're talking about modernizing our authorization, we're talking about moving beyond just role-based access control, starting to get a little bit more complex, moving beyond entitlements, using attributes, using relationships, and thinking about really human understandable policies, things like real-time data. When we're talking about centralized, we are talking about storage. We are talking about management. We're talking about governance. We're even talking about people things, right? So people helping an organization to implement unified authorization means that you probably have some kind of centralized, standardized, like helper function helping along the organization in this transformation journey. So I'll come back to this so that we can kind of put into place some of the things that we were just talking about, right? When we started talking about these pretty simple policies for this real world data, we are talking about attributes, not roles, right? Like if I were to ask you what user group does the person at the front of the line belong to, you would say, that's ridiculous. I'm not checking this person's user group. I am checking to see if they're over 18, if they meet the dress code, if they bought a ticket, right? So role-based access control entitlements, they work now. They will not work in the future. Next, we're talking about complex, understandable policies. I was able to very quickly and succinctly walk you through these policies in English. If you are relying on access control based on permissions assignments and entitlements, there is no way that you will ever be able to succinctly explain to me what someone can do and why they can do it. Some of the other things that you will start to see, for instance, when you start to externalize your policy representation, you can start to do new things, right? You can say, well, okay, they should not only not be too belligerent, but I'm also going to keep a list of people who are no longer allowed in the club, right? I have a deny list, right? And that policy should apply to whether or not they can get in and whether or not they can get a drink, right? If they happen to have slipped through your physical security, now the next time that they're making another authorization request, you're utilizing the same policy, and because it's externalized, you don't have to duplicate it, right? So what you start to be able to do in a unified authorization model with externalized policy is share policies, right? And what you can start to do is bring in external data, contextual data, when you are making authorization decision requests. Now, some of the other things that you might see is, well, what does externalizing mean? In this case, we're talking about externalizing it allows it to be at this kind of door person and this bartender. Now imagine you own a group of 10 clubs or 100 clubs or 1,500 clubs, right? If you have externalized your policies, then not everyone in every location needs to be told, like, individually what to do. They all get the memo. They all print out that memo, and they run through that checklist every single time someone comes to the door. And if you want to update it, you update it one time at your administration point, and suddenly it's distributed to all these places. And now you no longer have the problem that comes with decentralized management of your authorization policies, right? So what is the biggest thing that is going to be impacting authorization in the future? Well, it is fraud, scams, and financial crimes. And if you work in a regulated industry, you know this already. So this came from Interpol saying, you know, in 2023, there were $10 billion in losses due to fraud, and the FTC have to actually step in. So let's think about from a fraud and risk perspective, right? We're going to think about another authorization question, which isn't just can I buy an alcoholic drink, but can I put this on my tab? That brings up fraud risk. And you'll see right there, are you the tab owner? Can I just walk up to the bartender and say, I want this drink, and that guy's paying for it, right? If you told them that directly, they would say absolutely no. But if you went up and you said, oh no, I'm that person, maybe they'll let you do it, right? So fraud comes in as part of authorization. And when we are in this externalized, unified authorization model towards the future, this is really what zero trust means. Zero trust means that you are always rerunning your authorization policies. You are never trusting that someone else did their due diligence. That means that you're doing it at the front door, you're doing it when they ask for a drink, you're doing it when they are trying to put a drink on a tab, right? Some of the other things, right, you'll often see in these low trust or like high trust locations, right? If you walk up to the front of the club, they'll just stamp you if they see that you're over 21, and then you go to the bartender and he sees the stamp and he says, sure, you can buy that. That's high trust model, right? If we were in a low trust model or a zero trust model, that stamp would never exist. It wouldn't matter what someone else did. You would walk up to the bartender and they would check your ID again. They would see that you're 21, and that would be the point in time in which they make that authorization decision. So this is part of where the future should be going. And you'll see, you have regulatory risk. That's where the fraud and risk comes in. If you were to rely on what someone else told you, then guess what? Someone from the licensing board or the alcohol board can come in and they'll try and get around your systems. So zero trust models allow you to mitigate those kinds of regulatory risks. There's also that fraud risk that I was talking about before. So in 5 years, what we will start to see are many of these things, and I have another slide that's associated with it right now. So if you've heard of some of the people at this talk, or some of the other people at earlier talks, they've been talking about kind of standardizing the authorization protocol, the communication protocol. That work is likely going to be continuing for the next 5 years. Whether or not it's finished, we'll see, but it will at least be continuing. But what does that mean also? Someone mentioned it in the last talk. Custom off-the-shelf software and every new application eventually is going to have to be rewritten to allow for externalizing authorization decisions at a PDP. You, as a financial organization, as a regulated industry, are going to want Salesforce to not have its own permissions model. You are going to want it to be utilizing your organization's permissions model, your organization's policies. That's not possible right now because every single custom off-the-shelf software has its own permissions management system, right? So the future, 5 years from now, 15 years from now, is going to be exactly this. And like I said, zero trust means that you will also be authorizing people at every technology point. Doesn't matter if it's infrastructure. You'll do it again at the back end. You'll do it for north-south traffic. You'll do it for data. And this will finally allow us to actually do this kind of least privilege separation of duties, which when you're writing externalized policy is pretty simple. It just says like, do they have these attributes? And they don't have these attributes. Pretty simple. The hard part is getting the right data in the right places, getting the enforcement to be asking the right questions. Let's see, what else will be different in 5 years? You'll start to have these kind of organizationally mandated policies, and we'll start to be doing policy governance and policy overrides. So if you've got 100 application developers, every single one of them is working to externalize their data. Every single one of them is working to start asking policy authorization questions of somewhere else. At some point, your organization is going to say, I don't care what you want. I need to write a policy that is enforced everywhere. So you're going to start to have these hierarchical, organizationally mandated policies that override the end application developer. And you will also start to see things like policy versioning, data versioning, and policy promotion as part of policy governance, which really means that like you wrote a new policy. I'm not going to believe you when you say that you took the policy that I tested and put it into production. I'm going to want you to stamp it, and I'm going to validate that that exact policy, that exact artifact ended up in dev, ended up in test, ended up in stage, ended up in prod. So that's really how you close the loop on policy auditing and policy governance moving forward in the future. So when working with kind of a Fortune 100 financial company, some of the things that really have helped them be successful on their journey towards this unified authorization are these kinds of 5 things here. And it starts with, in my opinion, it starts with an organizational mandate, hopefully from leadership, that says it doesn't matter what we were doing before, we are investing the people, the processes, the products in order to make this happen going forward. Treating access management and authorization as a platform, so reducing all the undifferentiated heavy lifting so that the application developers have the easiest possible work possible to start using this kind of externalized authorization. There's a few other things, but enablement is obviously key, but really treating authorization and this unified authorization in the future as this kind of rolling transformational project. So I have spent a lot of time and effort over the last week or so architecting what I think might be the first maturity model for unified authorization. And again, this doesn't have vendor stuff associated with it. I'm not necessarily trying to sell you on what Styra does or Open Policy Agent, but these are just the broad strokes of what a mature organization looks like, or a low maturity organization looks like. And you'll see that level 2 right there is actually where policy starts to be externalized. Before that, you either have policy that's written or authorization that's written directly into your applications, or you're using role-based access control through kinds of entitlements and whatnot. So yeah, this is a sample. There are 2 more pages filled with, I think, 7 more categories. I believe there might be even more than that, to help organizations do an auditing of their current capabilities and use it. I know the people who come here might not be the CISO, right? You might not necessarily have the organizational leverage yourself in order to be able to like really move the needle on this kind of project. But I do know that if you were to take something like this and put it into the hands of your leadership and be like, hey, where do we rank? And they had to come back to you with their tail between their legs saying like, ooh, we didn't do that great, then maybe you can start to steer the conversation towards, well, what should we do next, right? What do we have to do in order to move on this? Because we're going to be left in the dust if everyone else starts to do this unified authorization thing and we don't. So some concrete takeaways for you all. I think that there are 3 things that you should do tomorrow. I really do believe that every single person here should try and do that maturity model exercise with their teams. Start a book club. Oh man, it says 111 there. How did that happen? Start a book club. That will likely mean reading white papers or blog posts or knowledge center content from either us or any of the vendors that you may have seen talking about authorization around. And if you are actually kind of interested in doing the implementation side of the house for this, you want to start tomorrow, you have the ability to do that. Identify a team that is very good at what they do, that has the leeway to move fast, and give them the application, either a new one or the one that they're already working on, and tell them, hey, try and do this with externalized authorization. Just try it. Take a week, try it, pick whichever one you want, and then with their success, use that to internally champion the next team that's going to try it, and then the next team that's going to try it. And that's kind of what I meant earlier about really treating this as a transformation project. It's unfortunate we tend to think like, oh, you can buy some kind of off-the-shelf solution and it'll solve all your problems. The reality is that no, like you will be helping your organization, or your organization will be transforming over the next 5 years and 10 years to do this. That's the unfortunate reality. So yeah, that is my talk. Thank you all. So we have 5 minutes for Q&A.
I have 1.5 questions. So I think that one of the things that's changed a lot, at least as far as my perception in the past few years, is that the perception of how realistic it is to get to a state where you are duplicating data to the places that it needs to be, or even on the proficient end of that, right? 4 years ago sounded like completely impossible. Nobody's doing that. That's crazy. Oh, okay, well, this company's doing it. Okay, well, hold on. There's a blog post from Airbnb now or whatever, right? And it starts feeling like people are actually doing it. But if you work somewhere where the opportunity cost of doing that is very, very high, I think one of the things that we struggle with is like, how do you articulate the value proposition of how much investment you need to make in order to get even a few of those checkboxes over to the next column? I'm curious if you have any opinions or pointers or things that you've seen be particularly useful, especially in those kinds of large organizations where the cost is high.
Yeah, that is one of the hardest parts. I would say starting small is the easiest way of doing it, right? Like if you try and get an entire organization to bite off the transformation of all of it all at once, you're probably going to fail, right? There's too much organizational inertia. But if you know of one application that has very minimal data sets that need to get distributed out, you can connect those data sets really quickly, and hopefully without a lot of red tape that you're doing, and then again use that kind of as a prover within the rest of the organization. I do think at some point, though, like I said, organizational mandates are key. At some point, you do need to get leadership to recognize that piecemeal solutions in this space will only get you so far, right? Investing in IGA solutions that just try and contain your entitlements explosion is only going to help you limp along for the next year or two until you buy another company and integrate another identity solution and have 500 more roles and 6,000 more permissions. That at some point you do have to be a little bit of a visionary to recognize that taking some of the time and effort to do it right early will pay off dividends in the end. And the nice thing / not so nice thing is that there are examples of this in the past, right? Containerization or application modernization or microservices. These are all also transformational projects that require significant investment, but oftentimes you'll see that curve where at the very beginning they were like, no, there's no way we can do this. We don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the resources for it. And then eventually they're like, oh man, we're behind the curve. We have to stop everything and we have to do this right now, right? So maybe lean into the fear a little bit, I would say. Any other questions? Nope.
I'll ask a question if nobody else is. A great presentation, Chris. Really like the maturity model that you shared. I think that'll help a lot of people kind of, put themselves somewhere in the classification. But my question's a little bit different. So if you were to start a book club tomorrow at my company, what would be one of 3 books or one book that you might suggest we read?
The reason why I put it as book club because that's the easiest thing to say, but the true unfortunate reality is that there really aren't any books out there about this right now. And if someone wants to give me an O'Reilly book contract right now, I'll start writing it. I would say, not to toot our own horn, but Styra has a knowledge center list of resources with primers on what IAM is, what an entitlement explosion is. There actually is a book, I think, with O'Reilly in development right now about, in their case, infrastructure as code and using Open Policy Agent and policy as code as a way of enforcing infrastructure guardrails for that. It's in early access, so it's kind of hard to fully recommend, but that's one of the ones that I would start with. But I have coworkers here. Do you guys have anyone else? Have you read any books that touch on this that you would really recommend? William?
You mentioned organizational change, starting small. There's a book by Chip and Dan Heath. If it's not on your shelf, it's called Switch. It's by Chip and Dan Heath, and it's just all about how organizations change and the process that Chris outlined in very brief. There's a whole book about that and how to, it's basically the idea of you create the small thing and that becomes the lighthouse, an example, and then you get leadership buy-in. So that is a recommended book, and that is generalized for any type of organizational change, but certainly for unified authorization.
Any other questions?
I have a kind of weird follow-up. Why do you think it is that there are no, like, the Authorization O'Reilly book? Like, why don't we have that? There are, like, a million identity books, you know, that it's just one of these domains that's so hard to get canonical buy-in on how to do things. I mean, maybe that is the answer, but, like, I don't know. I'm curious what your opinion is.
That is part of the answer. And if you happen to be at Identiverse last year, I had maybe 24 people who I spoke to who even knew the difference between authentication and authorization. This year, we have, you know, many, many dozens of people or hundreds of people who are filling up these kinds of things. I think the market is catching up to the knowledge is really what it is. And it's not that a lot of these ideas are fully new, but some of the stars have to align with there being companies in the market, there being products to try and help make these things better, those companies and other people working on educational resources. And it was pretty much swamped by people still trying to do unified identity, unified authorization. Last year, most people were asking, like, oh, how do I do multi-factor auth? And it's like, well, okay, now what, you know? So I think that's kind of where we are right now, and that's why we're at the precipice of people teaching each other about modernized authorization. All right. Thank you all for joining.